We're here with former member of Knesset, Michal Cotler-Wunsh. As a member of Knesset, you spent so much time and energy trying to teach Israel the need to strengthen its relationship with global Jewry, and in particular the large Jewish communities in the United States and Canada. Tell me what it is that you think that Israelis maybe don't understand about the American Jewish community.
So first of all, as the challenges rise in North America, in direct correlation to the challenge rising, the responsibility of the State of Israel as nation state of the Jewish people rises as well. And the importance of understanding what anti-Semitism is and what it looks like actually opens up that two-way bridge through the North American experience, the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards towards Israel that have enabled this mutation of anti-Semitism into what we see on campuses and on the streets as anti-Zionism, a legitimate form of anti-Semitism in today's sort of North American reality, very sadly, translates into what Israelis need to understand, not just in order to reach out and provide tools for our sisters and brothers around the world, in North America, but around the world, but also internally in Israel. And I would argue that the lose-lose of not knowing what anti-Semitism looks like, not knowing to identify it, especially when you consider that we have a definition, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the result of a 20-year democratic process that enables to identify and combat anti-Semitism, and that includes what we know of as those 3 Ds, the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards towards Israel. That is the source of the challenges in North America today that has mainstreamed anti-Semitism, of course cloaked as its new legitimate form, anti-Zionism. It's also the source of Israel's responsibility. Understanding it, using that definition, being able to identify anti-Semitism so we can combat it, in fact strengthens not only the relations with global Jewry, but internal Israeli challenges and resiliency between Jews and Arabs, and also, more importantly in many respects, in terms of Israel's standing in the international community, Israel's very legitimacy and right to exist as what it was founded to be, according to the Declaration of Independence.
You mentioned the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and it has been adopted all around the world, in Europe and the United States, and many of the state legislatures. In many ways, the American and the global Jewish communities may understand this definition better than Israel. So how is it that Israel can provide tools to support diaspora communities when it seems as though diaspora communities may understand the problem a little bit better than Israel?
So that's precisely it. That's precisely that two-way bridge. And including in the conversations that I've had with global Jewry, with communities and leadership around the world, the leaning in of North American communities doesn't just benefit the relations between Israel and global Jewry. It enables the survival and the understanding that Israel is lacking, that Israel is missing. I'll give you an example. The IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and by the way, there's a huge pushback on the IRA, the Jerusalem Declaration, and others that have omitted the 3 Ds, saying criticism of Israel is legitimate. Well, the IRA definition actually says specially exactly that. It stipulates that criticism of the State of Israel, like criticism of any other country, is legitimate. What's not legitimate is delegitimizing Israel, is applying double standards to principles that are then implemented only to Israel, singling it out. And in that sense, it's imperative that within our Knesset, and that's indeed what I tried to do while I was there, but also within our own universities. So you've mentioned the tens of countries, hundreds of cities, corporations, universities that are adopting IRA, because in order to identify and combat something, you have to be able to define it, and we have a definition. And here in Israel, no one has adopted IRA in that way. Not universities, not the Knesset, not agencies like the Jewish Agency that have to adopt IRA, and Ne'eh Doresh Ne'eh Mekayem. We've asked other countries, other universities around the world to utilize this comprehensive definition that actually accounts for the mutation of anti-Semitism that has been using the weaponization of human rights, and we've seen the results of that in the Amnesty International reports, in Human Rights Watch reports, accusing or peddling the libelous lie of Israel's an apartheid state. And here, ironically, within Israel, we haven't done or undergone the process of understanding and identifying and using a definition that has nothing to do with Israel in terms of its formation. That is, as I said, the product of a very long democratic process.
Well, we have a definition, and it's been adopted in so many places, as you mentioned, yet anti-Semitism is on the rise. What are the next steps that need to take place after first defining what anti-Semitism is? The cat is out of the bag. How do we put it back in?
So, of course, defining is just the first step. Without the implementation of the definition, without police forces, security forces, as I said, university administrations using that definition, applying it, implementing the intentionality between this comprehensive definition, it's not worth the paper it's written on. The next step is implementing. Now, I'll say the European Union has gone to some lengths actually producing a report on the implementation of the IRA. But we have to get in front of the train, when I say we, I mean the State of Israel, not behind the train, in front of the train, and certainly as active partners in this train that has left the station. Otherwise, when we see, the manifestations of anti-Semitism, be it on campuses or on streets, and Israel doesn't know to name what it sees in its streets or in the streets of Montreal, Toronto, Berlin, then the State of Israel, as that nation state, with the responsibility that comes of being a nation state to which an indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution, and that is committed to equality for all of its citizens, it actually is undermining its own vision, mission, values as anchored in the Declaration of Independence.
You talk about Israel's democratic rights and its diverse culture, different backgrounds of people living in Israel from all kinds of different countries, different colors, different religious beliefs. Israel is really one of the most liberal countries, not only in the Middle East, but in the entire world. And then, if you look at the American Jewish community in particular and Jewish communal leaders, they are also very liberal and have had unique ties to the Democratic Party in the United States for so many decades. How could it be that a liberal country with liberal support in the United States could get played out of the liberal norms in the United States and around the world?
So in many ways, I think we haven't spoken the right language. I think that the language of rights, the lingua franca spoken around the world, and you say the word liberalism, and actually it's liberal values that are being undermined. If indeed those liberal values have been weaponized, in addition to demonizing, delegitimizing, and singling out the State of Israel, what they've done is actually undermine the entire rules-based order, the entire infrastructure that those democratic countries like the United States, like Canada, are trustees of. And where Israel, I think, has a growing responsibility is to outstretch its hand precisely to Jewish communities of liberal persuasion, and exactly from that place of liberal values, with a true sense that Zionism is a progressive national liberation movement. We have to use that language, because when we don't, I said before, Jews are an indigenous people. When we don't use that language and it becomes weaponized to tell another story, and we don't even recognize what are the terms that are being utilized to undermine not only Israel, but as I said, human rights and liberal values generally, we are undermining not only Israel's ability and responsibility, but the ability to communicate with our sisters and brothers in the diaspora that come from liberal circles. And I'll say at this point, when I speak to students, they're pretty much homeless, right? If you think you're a progressive Jewish student, God forbid you identify as a Zionist, you're no longer wanted in your circles. We saw it with a women's march in Washington. You couldn't be, a feminist and a Zionist in those marches. And we have to take back, emancipate, if you will, Zionism from that understanding that has placed it as a pariah sort of movement, occupation, and for all kinds of other accusations that have been peddled at the State of Israel. But in leaving global Jewry on its own, and I'll say students in the front lines, on campuses, on their own, without the tools to be able to rise from the dock of the accused, to use the very same weapons that are being used against them, and not only be able to respond and react, but to be proactive. That's the most important challenge, as far as I can see, of our day. and the responsibility of Israel as that nation state to reach out and to outstretch its hand to the liberal communities around the world and say, because we're committed to those liberal values, because we are committed to your safety and our safety, which is one, the sense of peoplehood that transcends those real or perceived differences, politics and geography and religious denomination. And I'll say something. The truth is that those definitions of yesterday, of liberal and conservative, of religious and secular, they're almost irrelevant to where we're at.
We're here today at the Tikvah Fund's Conservatism Conference. So how do you merge or meld the conservatism values with the progressivism?
So in many ways, it's yesterday's language, it's yesterday's discourse. The real, it's not even below the surface, war that we are actually deeply engaged in, although in very many ways in absentia from, is between radicalism and extremism and between moderation, and especially in Israel. And by the way, I wouldn't equate American conservatism with Israeli conservatism. We've seen the Israeli public as a very, very pragmatic liberal audience. We saw it result after election after election after election, for many reasons, but also for that reason. The majority of Israel's public, certainly after Oslo, is not John Lennon's Imagine, and it's not very extreme right-wing. We are not in the extremes, and yet our political discourse has enabled the extreme voices rather than give representation to that, I call it national liberalism or liberal nationalism, in which we founded this country, right? I keep going back to that Declaration of Independence because that's our vision, mission, values. You can't just change that without telling anybody. Our sense of values comes from those three anchors. A, the state of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, to which, B, the Jewish people returned as an indigenous people after millennia of exile and persecution, and C, that is committed to equality for all. Those are liberal values from a very clear sense of personal and national identity, i.e. Jewish, and we call it Jewish and democratic. All of those principles, you can't just have some of them. And the real war for Israel's identity is, will it be what it was founded to be according to the Declaration of Independence, Jewish and democratic? Or will it be a democratic state of all its people, not what it was founded to be? Or will it be a Jewish halacha state, not what it was founded to be? And that is the war that we are internally and from the outside very deeply engaged in. We better speak the language and not hunker down in our preconceived notions of what conservative is and what liberal has become.
Michal, Cotler-Wunsh, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.